Hi, this is Trevor Conquergood. Welcome to this week's RNK Software Club's video of the week, and the topic for this week is the Steil Run tool. And so I've used that tool to create my initials, TC, and it just shows how you can use, I guess, different combinations of the Steil and the Run to create kind of a different visual effect. And so let's go ahead and take a look at how this all works. I guess the first thing I'll do is use a piece of artwork from our custom shapes library. And when you're in the custom shapes library, you can use the, I guess, pop-up right here to explore the folder. And so it says custom shapes and easy art. And so if you look in the easy art folder, that's where you'll find these letters. And so I took the letter T for Trevor, and it basically gives you just a piece of artwork. And so to create a Steil Run, what you want to do is find the tool. It's down at the bottom on the left here. It's in our sort of run or outline style tools. It's this one right here, the Steil-Run. And so if I click on that, it'll convert to the default settings. How's that? And so the default settings are going to give you a Steil with a run stitch on top, and it looks like this, and they'll be the same color. And so notice if I find in my sequence bar that letter T, and if I expand beside the letter T, I can see that it's a Steil Run, and it has two colors. And so if you want to have different colors, go ahead and click on one of those colors, and click on a new color on your color palette to change it. So you can see here that I've got a blue Steil stitch sewing first, and then a red run stitch sewing second. And if I click on the shape to select it, in the properties box, I have, I guess, really three different, or all of these tabs really are going to be things that you can do to affect this letter T. But the first one is where you get to choose which sews first. So right now it's set for the Steil stitch sewing first. If you'd rather the run stitch sew first, then choose that. Click apply, and so now the run stitch sews before the Steil stitch. So in this case, you don't probably see it because it's just a single run stitch underneath the different color Steil column. So that wouldn't make much sense, would it? But you can click on the shape and reverse that back. And so I guess the point is, what are you trying to create? And really the reason why you would use this tool is just it's kind of an efficiency thing, because really it's not a lot different than had you taken the letter T and made a copy of it and then pasted it and had like two letter T's directly on top of each other, and one of them was set as a run stitch and the other one was set as a Steil stitch. And so the Steil stitch is the column. That's like a satin column where the stitching goes back and forth. And you'll notice in the properties box that there's a tab for the Steil, or for the column, and a tab for the run stitch. And so if I click on the run stitch tab, you can see it's set as a single run. And if I click on the Steil stitch tab, you can see it's set as a 3mm wide column. If I want to make the column wider or smaller, I can just type that in here. And these are all of different preferences that you could choose, or settings, to affect the Steil stitch, right? So you've got all kinds of things. How shall it handle the corner of the Steil stitch? What density shall the stitching have? And on what angle and with what inset? And so these are all different, I guess, adjustments that you can use on a Steil stitch. So perhaps to go through them, well, the corner type, it's set on bevel. If you say round, basically we're talking about how to go around the corners. And so now I'm getting kind of like around the corner, but with just a slightly rounded point to it. And I could change that to be a sharp point corner. And so now those stitching will be nice and pointy in the corner. And I think the default was actually the bevel, right? So that's what you get with one click. You get kind of like a beveled corner. And again, those are things that you can change about a Steil stitch. Same thing with the angle. So 0 being kind of like straight across, but if I change that to be, let's say, 20 and click apply, notice how it tilted the stitches a little bit. And so if you want to have, this is an example. If it was a very small column and you adjusted the stitching, to go kind of a little bit sideways, it makes the stitches a little bit longer, even though they're not that far apart in the width. And so, and it can just be for an aesthetic purpose, right? That you can turn your stitches a little bit. And so there's really a lot of control that, it's why the program's called Floriani Total Control. It's got really the most control of any software you'll ever find in the whole market. And so these are the examples of things you can do. Right now, the inset is set at 50, which means from the center line, 50 to the outside, 50 to the inside. This is a question I've been asked a lot of times. What's the difference? Okay, we're going to take a little tangent. Still talking about the Steil Run, but the question often comes up, Trevor, what's the difference between a steel stitch and a satin stitch? Now, they're essentially the same, but there's some specific things about a steel. So when you have a line, and let's just take a pencil and go click and right click and draw a line and select that line and look down to the bottom. Today we're looking at the Steil Run, but right beside it is the steel stitch. And so if we just choose steel, we'll get the steel, but without the extra run. So the thing to keep in mind with a steel stitch is that it's always set from a single center line. And that's really what makes it, it's got a single column width. So right now the default set at 2.5 millimeters. If I change it to 4, it'll get bigger. So the idea is it's got a constant width. And that is different than when we use, and if I draw a piece of artwork that has a line that goes like this, and then comes back like this. So now we've got a shape that has sort of two boundaries, a left side and a right side, or a top bottom. Really, I guess it has three boundaries because I left it open, but you could consider that the fourth boundary, and you can even close the shape if you want. Just click on the close shape tool. So essentially this has, there's really 6 sides, Trevor, but I'm kind of thinking of it like the north and the south and the east and the west, because technically there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sort of shapes here. But the point is, if I select this and I click on the satin tool, here's auto satin. So auto satin will put stitching in there. Now you'll notice right away, because it got kind of wide, that it got a split on it. Now that's not necessarily anything that makes it different from a steel stitch, because if you make your steel stitch fat enough, you can put splits on that as well. So notice the tab right here for splits, and how it's turned to none on the steel stitch, but you can turn that on if you want it to be. And by default on a satin column, it is turned on, and it has these basic settings of a minimum stitch of 7, which means as soon as my satin column reaches 7 millimeters from this point to this point, and it's any longer, the stitching will divide it and I'm using, I think, a random split, right? Because you could also do a middle split, which would go right down the middle. Now we're kind of getting far along on the tangent here, and I want to get back to the Steil Run, but getting back to the question, how is a satin stitch different from a steel stitch? And what I'm trying to say here, and if I stop, so at the middle split, let's just make this smaller so that it's not split, so that we can just imagine how they're similar, but they're different. And so they're both satin columns now, and they don't have any splitting. So notice how they're similar, but how they're different is that a satin column can have any shape. So it can be any width, and it can be a changing width. And another thing that's different about a satin column is that you can control the angles. We call those inclinations, and you would go into your shape tool and you can see them here. There's essentially 1, 2, 3 of them right now, but notice that I can actually change them and have different ones. And so now I've got a shape that has sort of one angle on the left changing to a different angle on the right. And so that's something very different, because typically a column like this will have one angle. Now, I showed you that on the steel stitch, you can adjust the angle by selecting the steel stitch properties and changing the angle from 0 to, let's say, 25, and it'll rotate it 25 degrees. So, but they're very different and they're very similar. So they're both a satin column, but specifically when you use the steel stitch tool, it's a fixed width. And so this is really what we're talking about. And if you ever wondered the answer to that question, there it is. So now coming back to the T, and essentially what we have is one letter T that has both the steel and the run. And what I was, I think, saying before was it's really not entirely different than having two T's and one of them being the steel and one being the run. It's just an efficiency thing, right? You get it all in one tool. So with one shape, you can have two kind of types. It's a lot of fun, and you'll find that if you put the steel first and the run is on top, a lot of times we go with just, really when the run's on top, it could be a single run right down the middle, just like it is now. Maybe you want to take that column and make it slightly wider, the blue part. And so select over here, change it from a 2mm column to a 4mm column, and then change the run stitch on top of it to be a double run, and it'll have a blue satin column with a nice bold red line down the middle. Or select again, so select your shape, change the run stitch to be a motif stitch. And now on top of your steel stitch, we're going to sew a decorative stitch. And this is really, really creative stuff. Now you've got a lot of different motif patterns that you can choose from. And whichever one you do becomes kind of the next one that will sew in your kind of column like this. And so notice that when I select that steel stitch, the motif stitch, that one of the options is the pattern size. And sometimes we like to adjust those, especially on something like this, where you're trying to make it fit with a steel stitch. And it might make sense to, go onto those settings and change the pattern size to make it look like it kind of wraps around your blue bar, so to speak. So really, you'll be surprised what you can create when you combine the steel stitch with the run stitch. So the flip side is if you do, and so I did the T and then I did the C, for my last name is Conquergood. And so again, I just used a custom shape, letter C, and brought that in. And so we use the same tool, the steel run, and this time we reverse it. So now we do the run first and then the steel second. And so go ahead and click apply and then adjust the run to be perhaps a motif again. And then adjust the column to be, you can't really change it from much to being a column, but what I might do is change its size, right? Because notice now the way I've got it set up right now that you can't really see much of the decoration that's in behind. And so one option might be to come in and make the decoration bigger, right? So it's set at 5. Let's try 10. Click apply. That kind of pops it outside like that. And so that's really what I was sort of playing with, was just trying different motif styles and trying different sizes of motifs to get, kind of a nice effect. So I made the motif a little larger, and then I went and I made the width on the column a little bit smaller. And so now I have, and I guess I also, definitely not a rule, but, to change the color of one or the other of them. So now I've got a blue motif with a red steel stitch on top. Anyway, you guys, the steel run is a ton of fun. I will say one thing about motifs. We talked about the steels and the settings of the steels. The other option was the motifs and the run stitches. And the one thing I want to say about motifs is watch out for the pattern size. Certainly if you're using larger than smaller pattern sizes, you will have, less numbers of stitches. And all I'm really concerned about is some of the motifs, if you make them too small, the stitches might get kind of small. And so what we're talking about, and there's a general principle that you can keep in mind, and that's that, really the needle needs to move a certain distance before it goes down again. Because, when the needle goes into the fabric, it makes a hole. Here, let's turn on needle points and turn off 3D. Can you see all the needle points? And what I'm saying is when the needle goes down, and look for areas where, you have two that are kind of close together, and measure them. Take your ruler and find out how close are they. Okay, it's 1.7 millimeters, and I'm happy to tell you that will be successful. However, you need to be cautious for times when you see stitches that are under 1 millimeter, and really 1.5 is a nice minimum to reach. What you'll find is that if you get and especially with columns that go back and forth like this red one, right here, if I measure it, it's 2 millimeters across, and that's, I believe, what I set it at. What I'm telling you is you can set your column as small as 1 millimeter, and it could be successful. That said, 1.5 is better as a good minimum. And the reason, I mean, if you just think of your actual needle, and the needle is almost 1 millimeter wide. You know, your typical size 11 needle is about 3/4 of a millimeter wide. And so when it goes into the fabric, it makes a hole. And when the needle comes out of that hole and moves to the next stitch, that's called the stitch length. And if you don't move a minimum of 1 millimeter, the needle will probably just go right back into the hole that it just came out of. And so my point here is be careful with motifs that you don't set them too small. I've got the pattern size set at 10. If I set the pattern size at 4, it might seem really beautiful. But what we need to be concerned about is the distance. And so if I use my ruler and I measure, and if I find that one stitch to the next is smaller than 1 millimeter, I'm not saying it won't sew. I'm just saying that it won't sew as well as it will if they're longer. And certainly for your satin column, you'll find that if you try and make the steel stitch part of it, like very small, like, I don't know, maybe you set it at 0.5 millimeter wide or something like that. And it looks like it can, well, it sort of looks like it'll work on the screen, but you can see right away how it's really not, they're just not far enough. And so that's my one tip for you guys. It's the 1.5 millimeter kind of general guideline. Try to keep your stitches not smaller than 1.5 millimeters. Now, if you prefer to talk in inches, that is the one part of the software that always stays in metric, is that sort of width of the steel stitches. Because notice, first of all, let's set it back to 1.5, a reasonable minimum. And if I right click on the ruler right now and change it to inches, and then come back into my settings box, still says millimeters. So the one thing that, a lot of things do change to inches, but when we talk about density and sort of column widths for things like steel stitches, we usually use millimeters because it's easier to measure, 1, 2, and 3 millimeters than it is to figure out exactly how to type in that, fraction of an inch sort of thing. And so, okay, you guys, kind of an interesting topic today. It's the Steil Run. Now, I want to say one last thing about this, and that is, sometimes you want to have an underlay on the steel stitch. And by default, the steel stitch doesn't come with an underlay. And I noticed when using the Steil Run tool, there's no tab to add any underlay. So that's something, I'll add as a note. Maybe we can enhance that in the future. But for today, if you want to use this effect and you feel that your column needs, because if your column gets quite wide, you may want to have some underlay. And that would be the time to say, okay, fine, then I think I will do copy and paste and have 2 of the exact same letter T and make one of them be the steel stitch and one of them be the, what am I trying to say? So paste it down and have the one that you pasted on top be the motif. And that way you're kind of manually making the same effect with 2 shapes, but that will give you that extra level of control, because now I can take the steel of the T and use the properties box that does include things like adding an underlay to those stitches. And so just keep that in mind, that when you use the Steil Run, it's great when you're using, not too wide steel stitch columns, because you really don't need that underlay, especially if you're putting that motif over top of it like that. But if you're going to push that steel stitch column to be, beyond the 3 millimeter into the 4 and 5, you might find that you really wish that there was some extra stitching underneath it to give it a little more loft. And so that's all my tips today about the Steil Run tool. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Until next week, have a great day, and bye for now.